Today, in service to our duty to the Constitution and to our country, the House Committee on the Judiciary is introducing 2 articles of impeachment charging the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, with committing high crimes and misdemeanors.
It's Wednesday, December 11th. I'm Julie Pace, Washington Bureau Chief for the Associated Press. And this is Ground Game.
Time after time, you've heard Democrats in this House say exactly that. They're not impeaching the president because they can list an impeachable offense. They're impeaching him because they're afraid he will get reelected. That's not why you have the power of impeachment. That's the abuse of power.
Yesterday, House Democrats introduced 2 articles of impeachment against President Donald Trump, alleging abuse of power and obstruction of Congress regarding his interactions with Ukraine. The articles are narrower than some Democrats had hoped, but they're also consequential, setting the stage for Trump to be just the 3rd president in American history to be impeached by the House. Then we turn to the 2020 campaign. Democrats began their primary with a historically diverse field. But the next Democratic debate will feature only one candidate of color. And it's not who you might expect. The House is pressing ahead with impeachment of President Donald Trump, focusing on 2 articles related to his dealings with Ukraine. No reporter has been deeper in this story than AP's Mary Clare Jalonick, who has spent more hours than she cares to remember roaming the halls of Congress and staking out closed-door hearings. Mary Clare, thank you so much for taking time to be with us.
Hi, yeah, it's great. I'm actually in a little ancient phone booth in the Rayburn office building trying to find a quiet place. So, yeah.
The glamorous life of a reporter covering impeachments. So, Mary Clare, we had a really significant day yesterday where the House came out and announced the articles of impeachment. I was struck by the fact that they focused on 2 articles, obstruction of Congress and also abuse of power. What were the discussions like leading up to this? How did we end up in this place with 2 articles?
Yeah, it was really kind of up until the last minute. We weren't sure that there might be a 3rd article as well. There were robust discussions about, the 2 articles are on abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. And there was a lot of discussion about whether there should be a 3rd article on obstruction of justice that would focus mostly on former special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation, where he said he couldn't exonerate Trump on obstruction of justice. And that's obviously been a huge focus for Congress. It's something that a lot of Democrats have been focused on and they feel was definitely impeachable. But in the end, some moderate Democrats had really pushed to just keep it narrow, keep it to the Ukraine issue, because they felt like that was a much clearer case than bringing an entire second investigation into the matter. They feel like the Ukraine episode is really easy to explain and that it's definitely impeachable, that they can make that case in terms of the Constitution. And so in the end, they really did just narrow it to the 2. And surprisingly to me, they did not even mention Mueller in the articles of impeachment. I thought they might, just at least use it as an example. And they do that, but they don't mention the investigation by name. They just say this is consistent with past things that Trump has done.
And this focuses in large part on the obstruction of Congress article. Let's dig into that for a minute, because I think for some people it might be a little unclear what we're talking about specifically. So this relates to this idea that the House was asking for things, for documents, for interviews that Trump and his administration were saying no to. How does that play with lawmakers when the executive branch says no?
Right. That's from the beginning, that has been the clearest case for them. And this was something that also happened during their Mueller investigation, was that Trump just sort of wrote this long letter at the beginning of the Ukraine investigation saying, no, I'm not going to comply with any of this. This is a sham. It's not a real investigation. It's not a real impeachment. And we're not complying. And, obviously, as we saw, several government officials, particularly career government officials and some political officials, came anyway under subpoena. But a lot of people, especially higher ranking officials like Mick Mulvaney and Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Rick Perry, Secretary of Energy, all did not come under Trump's orders. So really, there's nothing more clear to members of Congress. They have the right to call whoever they want to call, especially under subpoena. And Trump just said no. So to them, that's really sort of the fundamental basis of the Constitution is the separation of powers. So I think that was a really easy one for them to write.
And yet you don't expect that Republicans, even on that article on obstruction of Congress, will vote for it?
No, I mean, no, we don't really expect to see anybody break party lines. I guess somebody could surprise us. But as far as we know, they're really sticking together. And I guess that could be an interesting thing to watch, if the roles are reversed in the future, if they're voting against that. But no, it looks like it's going to be a pretty partisan impeachment. And if there's a bipartisan vote, it would probably be against the articles, because there's a few Democrats who are looking at voting against it.
As I mentioned, Mary Clare, you have spent hours upon hours in the Capitol during this process. What has the atmosphere been like, especially in the last couple of days as House leaders have moved toward these articles? What's the vibe up there right now?
It's really interesting because it's just been so fast. I covered the Russia investigation, the Mueller investigation for 2 years before this started, 2.5 years actually before this started. And, that really went on for obviously a really long time. And it was just sort of a drip, drip. This was just, Pelosi announced this in late September. And to think about everything that they've done since then, it's really extraordinary. They've had closed door hearings, they've had open hearings, they've drafted articles of impeachment. It's just been moving really fast. So that's sort of what everything feels like. It's just every second, every hour, there's new news. And they've really stayed on schedule with this. They're expecting to have a vote next week, a final House vote next week. And it just feels really, really fast. And it feels like it's just moving really swiftly and almost hard to catch your breath sometimes and to step back and to think about, everything here that's going on.
Worth noting that Congress is not typically a body that moves quickly or stays
That's
on
right.
schedule.
Exactly. That's why it's different.
So this process, if this goes the way we expect it to over the next couple of days, and the House does vote to impeach Trump, this process moves to the Senate, which is a very different body. How do the political dynamics change, if at all, as we get to the Senate?
It definitely changes because, the president, I think Trump really feels like this is his big chance to be on offense. And I think because it is a Republican-controlled chamber. So, McConnell and the Republican majority will get to make the decisions about the rules and all of that. So, where the Democrats have been calling the shots in the House, they'll be able to do, sort of work things to the Republicans' advantage, to Trump's advantage in the Senate. I think we'll definitely see continued partisanship, but with, the Republicans having more of an upper hand. I know there's a lot of Democrats and maybe some Republicans who would like to see a bipartisan process, which is what happened 20 years ago in the Clinton impeachment. I think they unanimously agreed on rules, and I would be surprised if we see that again in the Senate. I would assume the Republican majority will be really setting the rules and the length of the trial and figuring out, exactly how it's all structured.
One of the things that I've been really struck by during this process is that Trump wants the Republicans to defend him on the substance of what he's done. We've heard a few pockets of GOP lawmakers here and there sort of raise concerns about his phone call with the Ukrainian president, with some of the other actions that we heard described in the depositions and in the public hearings. But Trump wants the Republicans to defend what he did. What kind of position has that put the GOP in as they try to navigate their own politics in this situation?
Yeah, it has been interesting because we've seen a lot of different arguments from the Republicans, a lot of frustration, a lot of, arguing on the process, although there has been some on the substance. We've heard, a real variety of arguments, including echoing Trump saying, he's the president, he can do what he wants. Doug Collins, who's the top Republican on the Judiciary Committee, sort of saying similar things, but he keeps saying, they don't have anything. There's no real impeachment here. There aren't impeachable offenses. I talked to him this morning and he said, oh, well, they're only doing 2 because they don't have enough evidence. That's not why they only did 2. But I think they're put in a tough position because there isn't a consistent message out of the Republican Party. Different lawmakers are sort of saying different things, but they are very united, at least in opposing impeachment and, calling this an unfair process and saying that the Democrats have really wanted to impeach Trump from day one and that they're doing this just because they don't like him. And I think that's probably what they see as one of the arguments that resonates the best.
Obviously, there will be a lot of dramatic moments when we get to the Senate trial, a lot of big witnesses who will be called. But before we let you go, Mary Clare, and get back to reporting, I just want to take a minute to go through some of the things that stood out to you about the House process. You were in the room for a lot of big days during the public hearings. Who were the witnesses and what were the moments that really resonated with you?
I think Fiona Hill really saying, this was a domestic political errand. I think she really seemed to resonate in the room. Actually, in the room, it was a little probably less dramatic because it was hard to hear some of the time. Yeah, it was very interesting. The hearings, it was kind of when they set all of those hearings, it just seemed like a lot. And I wasn't sure if they should have had so many hearings in one week, if it would just overwhelm. But it does seem like they were able to get witnesses with a pretty consistent message. I think they were very pleased with the outcome of those hearings. But also there were a lot of moments in the closed door depositions, which happened mostly through the month of October, when Bill Taylor, the current top official in Ukraine, came and really talked about and laid out a lot of the elements of what looked like a quid pro quo as, Trump was pressuring Ukraine to investigate Democrats. That his opening statement was pretty dramatic. There have been a lot of really interesting moments, and it's hard to almost step back and remember all of them because it's gone so fast. But now we're in like a completely different phase, and they've sort of wrapped all of those arguments into a neat bow. And now in only 9 pages of 2 articles of impeachment that they'll start to work on this week.
One thing I'm sure you're not going to miss are those late night stakeouts. There's a great picture.
No, I will not.
There's a great picture I saw of you, Mary Clare, you and a couple of other reporters on a staircase waiting for somebody to come out. I don't know who it was that you guys were waiting for, but it was a perfect glimpse into the life of a congressional reporter.
Yeah, I walk by that area and I'll always remember this time. I mean, that has been it's a really it's an underground room that is a secure skiff that they go in and out of. And through the Russia investigation, we spent a lot of time outside of that as well. So, we know the sound of the doors opening and closing. I think it makes all of us jolt probably in our sleep. So yeah, it's been quite a run for the last couple months.
Well, it's not over yet. A lot of news to report. We will let you get back to it. Mary Clare Jalonick, AP congressional reporter, thank you so much for being with us today.
Great. Thanks so much.
When we come back, we're on the ground with the Yang Gang. Andrew Yang started the 2020 Democratic primary as something of a novelty, but he's outlasted several governors and senators and will be the only candidate of color in the December debate. AP political reporter Sarah Burnett just spent time with Yang in Chicago, where he was campaigning. Sarah, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So we have some news on Andrew Yang. He was waiting for one last qualifying poll to get on the stage for the December Democratic debate. He's now on there. What does this mean for Yang? How significant is this?
Well, it's very significant. I mean, as we know, there are other candidates, senators included, like Cory Booker, who have not qualified. To your point in the intro, I mean, he is outlasting folks. He is raising a lot of money, and this should only help him do more of that, but also, get his name out there. And perhaps as important to him, his ideas. He wants to really push his freedom dividend, the universal basic income, and that's really what's driving his run. And of course, every opportunity, even though he tends to only get a very few minutes during these debates, he usually spends them talking about this idea that really his signature policy.
I want to dig in on that policy in a couple minutes, but you just spent some time with Yang. He is so interesting as a campaigner because, you and I have spent a lot of time with candidates. They can be pretty staged. They can be pretty scripted. Yang is anything but. What is he like as a campaigner? What was it like spending time with him on the ground?
I described him to a couple people as a serious guy who doesn't take himself serious. You can tell he's a very intelligent guy who has thought through a lot of stuff, done a lot of research, can just rattle off statistics and numbers and things like that. I mean, there are a lot of politicians who can do that. He certainly wouldn't consider himself a politician.
I always love when people who are running for president don't consider themselves politicians. Like you're in the biggest political arena.
I know. He's literally just a guy who wants to push this idea, what he really sees as a better way forward for the country. And it's like he thought about it for a really long time and decided the best way to get it done was to run for president and win. And so that's what he's trying to do. But it is clear that this is not a real natural environment for him. You know, someone said to me, one of his fans, they call themselves the Yang Gang, said to me, you know, it's kind of awkward sometimes. Like he tells jokes that don't really land. Sometimes you can't tell. There was a point during my interview with him where I wasn't really sure if he was fake laughing or really laughing. And we had this awkward exchange where I said, was that your fake laugh? And he said, no. And it's like, oh, okay. You know, we see him doing things like in New Hampshire where it was a snowy night, they were having hot cocoa, and someone handed him this thing of whipped cream that was supposed to go on top of the cocoa, and instead he's squirting it into the mouths of some of his supporters, and his campaign manager is trying to get him to stop and pull him away.
And yet, it's kind of working for him. You know, we mentioned he's on the debate stage, he's raising a lot of money, and he does have a platform for his ideas at this point.
Absolutely. People see him as authentic. A lot of his supporters are people who are frustrated by politics as usual. Kind of the same sentiment that we saw with President Trump's election. The thing they like about him is that he's not a politician. And the fact that he's just sort of willing to do random things like pull someone up on stage to break dance, which he did. I mean, he didn't break dance. This guy break danced just sort of randomly during the middle of his Chicago rally. They think that's funny, and that's like something that they might do. And they find him approachable and, a person who's kind of like them and not like the rest.
And yet, he does have some very serious and, to his credit, pretty well thought out, if unconventional, policy proposals. Tell us what he is pushing when he's out there. What's at the top of his agenda?
Well, his number one policy is the universal basic income, which he calls a freedom dividend. And it's an idea that basically every adult who in the country who opts into this would get $1,000 a month. Kind of like how people get Social Security and dropped into their bank account, only this is money that would come from taxing some of the companies that are most benefiting from automation. And so all the companies that he says have laid off millions of people and replaced them with robots and aren't paying payroll taxes anymore, or different types of taxes that they're getting away with not paying, would instead go into, they would be taxed to help this fund. And he calls it a freedom dividend because it would give people, the ability to maybe do some things that they haven't been able to do, like go back to school or pay off bills or buy a guitar and learn how to play it. There's things like that, but it's also intended for people like his wife. He has a son who's autistic. His wife stays home with their two boys. She cares for them. He believes, she's providing value to society, and this would compensate her for that in some way.
He actually got into this really interesting exchange with Elizabeth Warren on automation to this point in one of the first debates. And it's very clear that in this area, he has spent a lot of time thinking about this, as you mentioned, probably in a much different context than running for president. But he also comes from a very unconventional background for someone who is running for president. We have a president currently in Donald Trump who wasn't a politician. What does Yang say about this idea? Does the country want another unconventional president, somebody who doesn't come from the political arena?
Right. I think what he would say is that he obviously sees himself as very different from President Trump, and he believes that what the country is looking for is someone who will look out for them. And his campaign slogan is humanity first, putting people first. That is, what he believes that the president said he was going to do, but he doesn't think that Trump has delivered on that. And he says that he he would.
Well, it's going to be fascinating to see what Yang does when we actually get into voting, whether he's able to turn this fundraising and these debate performances into any kind of success in the polls. Before we go, Sarah, you have been following another one of the candidates who is hanging on back on the debate stage in December. That's Amy Klobuchar, the senator from Minnesota. She seems to be someone who is on the rise, a slow and steady rise, but is she potentially peaking at the right time?
Well, she would say that she is, and she would say that this has been her plan all along. I was with her in Iowa. I don't remember if it was March or April, but it was the weekend that Beto O'Rourke, the former congressman from Texas, had announced that he was going to run. And if you recall, there was the magazine cover and a huge, huge media following, and he was standing on countertops in coffee shops all over Iowa, and the media was following him around, and there were like 4 or 5 of us reporters who were with Amy Klobuchar, 100 miles away. And every stop, she kept getting asked about that. And her answer then, as now, is that, that's fine, he can do that. I'm going to run my race, and I'm just going to keep doing the work and grow slowly. And I don't want to peak right now. I want to peak January, February, when folks start voting. And I asked her about that a couple weeks ago in New Hampshire, and I said something along the lines of, now you're still here and Congressman O'Rourke is not. And she just looked at me and said, your words, not mine. But her point being, without pointing fingers at the people who she has outlasted, she is still here. And this, if you're going to peak, this is the time to do it. Now, whether that will be anywhere near enough is another question.
She has, though, started to build out her operation beyond Iowa, which is really where she's focused. You mentioned you were with her in New Hampshire. Is she now trying to catch up with some of these other candidates, looking beyond Iowa and starting to run as though she could be in this race for quite some time?
Yeah, New Hampshire has always been a close second to Iowa for her, but she really has not invested much at all or spent much time in Nevada and South Carolina, which vote 3rd and 4th. So she's had some good debate performances and has really seen her fundraising improve off of those. And she's taken that money and used it, yes, to strengthen her Iowa operation and New Hampshire, but also has opened her first offices in Nevada and is doing some staffing in South Carolina as well. So she definitely has to play catch up in those states. But I think she also knows that if she doesn't do well in Iowa and certainly in New Hampshire, that it's not going to matter beyond that for her.
Lots to come in the next few weeks of this exciting presidential campaign. Sarah Burnett, our new Yang Gang reporter, thank you so much for being with us on Ground Game.
Thanks, Julie.
That's it for this week's Ground Game from the Associated Press. We'll be here every Wednesday for the latest political news from the Beltway and beyond. Be sure to tell a friend about us, and please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. From the Westwood One Podcast Network.